She took down half the Alpha King's hunters. Instead of punishment, he ordered her brought to his palace. The forest floor shook as 6 armored figures moved between the pine trees, their boots crushing frost into the dark soil. They were not ordinary soldiers. Each one wore the silver crest of the Ashcombe Royal Guard, and each one had been trained since childhood to hunt down rogue wolves who refused to bow to the crown. Tonight, their target was a name, whispered with fear, across 3 villages. Kira, the last survivor of the Hollow Ridge Pack. She was already watching them. From a low branch above a frozen stream, Kira lay flat against the bark, her breath slow and controlled despite the cold biting through her thin cloak. Her eyes, sharp and golden, followed every movement of the men below. She had learned long ago that hunters like these did not come alone, and they never came without a plan. But neither did she. The leader of the group, a broad-shouldered man named Callum, raised his hand, and the others stopped in place. He knelt beside a set of tracks pressed into the frost, tracks too light and too fast to belong to anything but a wolf, moving with purpose. He looked up toward the tree line, scanning slowly, unaware that the very creature he searched for was directly above him. "She's close," Callum said quietly. "Spread out. Remember, the king wants her found, not killed on sight. We bring her back." One of the younger hunters, a nervous man named Peter, glanced around uneasily. "They say she took down 4 men from the Western Patrol without a single weapon, just her hands and her speed." "Rumors," Callum said, though his voice lacked conviction. Kira's lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. Rumors. She had heard that word before, always spoken by men who had never faced her and lived long enough to describe what they saw. She shifted her weight silently, feeling the tension coil through her limbs like a drawn bowstring. Below her, the hunters fanned out in a wide circle, each one holding a torch that cast flickering light against the trunks of ancient trees. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere far off, an owl called into the night, and the sound sent a ripple of nervous energy through the younger members of the group. Kira waited. Patience was a weapon sharper than any blade, and she had spent years learning to wield it. She thought of her home, the village nestled in the valley below Hollow Ridge, the laughter of her family before the fires came, before the king's decree turned neighbors into enemies and packs into ash. She thought of the night everything changed, the night she had been forced to run, while the world she loved burned behind her. That memory was the fuel that kept her moving, even now, years later, alone, in a forest that had become both her prison and her sanctuary. A twig snapped beneath Peter's boot, and Callum's hand shot up again, signaling silence. The group froze, torches raised, eyes darting between shadows. It was the perfect moment, the exact heartbeat of stillness that Kira had been waiting for. She dropped from the branch without a sound. Her boots touched the ground behind the last man in line, a broad-chested hunter named Garrick, before he even registered movement. She moved past him in a blur, her hand striking the base of his neck with practiced precision, dropping him instantly into unconsciousness. He crumpled to the ground with barely a whisper of noise. The others spun around at the soft thud, torches swinging wildly, but Kira was already gone, vanished into the darkness between the trees. "She's here," Callum shouted, command in his voice cutting through the sudden chaos. "Form up, backs together, now." The remaining hunters scrambled into a tight circle, weapons raised, eyes scanning every shadow with growing panic. Peter's hands trembled as he gripped his blade, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Kira circled them like a phantom, using the darkness and the confusion of firelight to hide her movements. She studied each man, searching for weakness, for the smallest gap in their formation. She found it in a man named Osric, whose attention kept drifting toward the sound of the stream instead of the trees around him. She struck again. This time she came from the side, moving low and fast, sweeping Osric's legs from beneath him before he could react. He hit the ground hard, the wind driven from his lungs, and Kira was already retreating before anyone could turn to help him. "Two down," Peter cried, his voice cracking with fear. "She's toying with us." "Hold the line," Callum ordered, though his own voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. He turned in a slow circle, torch raised high, trying to catch even a glimpse of movement. "She can't take all of us." But Kira had spent years surviving in a world that wanted her gone, She had learned that fear was a weapon, just as sharp as any blade. And right now, fear was spreading through this group like frost across still water. She let them see her this time. Stepping into the edge of the torchlight, she allowed her golden eyes to catch the flame, letting the hunters see the outline of her face, the calm and unshaken posture of someone who had already decided how this encounter would end. For a moment, no one moved. "Stand down," Callum said, though the words sounded more like a plea than a command. "We're not here to harm you, unless you force our hand. The king wants you brought back alive." Kira tilted her head slightly, studying him with something between curiosity and disdain. "Your king burned my home. He does not get to decide what happens to what is left of me." Before Callum could respond, she moved again, faster than any of them expected. She closed the distance between herself and a hunter named Denholm, disarming him with a swift motion, before he could even raise his blade properly. He staggered back, more startled than hurt, and Kira used the moment of confusion to slip past the loosening circle. "She's not fighting to win," Peter said suddenly, his voice filled with dawning realization. "She's fighting to escape." But Callum had already reached the same conclusion, and he was not willing to let her slip away so easily. He lunged forward, closing the gap between them with surprising speed for a man his size. Kira twisted away just in time, his blade grazing nothing but air, and she used his own momentum against him, redirecting his charge into the trunk of a nearby tree. He hit it hard, the impact knocking the torch from his hand, and darkness swallowed half the clearing. In that instant of confusion, 3 more hunters lay disabled on the forest floor, groaning but alive, while the remaining 2 scrambled backward, no longer certain of their advantage. Only Callum remained standing among the original group who had entered the forest with confidence. "Enough," Kira said, her voice carrying easily through the darkened clearing. "Tell your king that I am not the monster his stories describe. Tell him that if he wants an end to this, he should look at what his own hands have done." She melted into the shadows before anyone could respond, leaving behind a scene of scattered torches, groaning men, and a silence heavier than any battle cry. By the time Callum managed to gather his remaining men and drag the fallen back toward the road leading to the capital, dawn was already breaking over the horizon. His pride was wounded far worse than his body, and he knew that whatever report he brought back to the palace would not be an easy one to deliver. News of what happened in the forest spread quickly, faster than any messenger could carry it by horse. By the time Callum's group limped through the gates of Ashcombe City, whispers had already begun circulating among market vendors and palace staff alike. A single wolf, alone and unarmed, had defeated half of an elite hunting party sent by the crown itself. Inside the towering walls of the Ashcombe Palace, a young servant girl rushed through marble corridors, her footsteps echoing off the polished stone as she hurried toward the throne room. She had heard the story from a stable boy, who had heard it from a guard at the gate, and though she knew better than to spread rumors, this one felt too important to keep quiet. In the throne room, King Draven Ashcombe sat upon his high seat, listening to reports from his council, with the same practiced patience he had shown for years since taking the crown. He was a man built more for strategy than for brute strength, his sharp mind, often serving as his greatest weapon, in a kingdom surrounded by threats both foreign and domestic. When Callum finally arrived, bruised and humbled, to deliver his report in person, the entire court fell into stunned silence. "Your Majesty," Callum began, kneeling before the throne with his head bowed low, "we located the rogue wolf known as Kira in the forest beyond Hollow Ridge. She resisted capture. 4 of my men were disabled before we could regroup." A murmur rippled through the gathered nobles, disbelief and unease mixing in equal measure. Draven's expression remained unreadable, his fingers tapping slowly against the armrest of his throne as he processed the report. 4 men, he repeated quietly. "Disabled, not killed." "Yes, my king," Callum confirmed. "She could have ended their lives. She chose not to." This detail seemed to catch Draven's attention more than anything else in the report. He leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes narrowing with something that resembled curiosity rather than anger. "She had the advantage and chose restraint," he said, almost to himself. "That is not the behavior of a mindless creature bent on destruction." One of his advisors, an older man named Chancellor Aldrich, stepped forward with obvious concern etched across his weathered face. "Your Majesty, this wolf has now humiliated the crown twice. If word spreads that she cannot be captured, others may see it as an invitation to rebel against your authority. Draven considered this for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the tall windows where morning light spilled across the throne room floor. Somewhere beyond those walls, in a forest she likely considered her only home, a lone wolf had just proven herself capable of standing against forces that had crushed entire packs without effort. "Double the search party," Draven finally said, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the murmuring court instantly. "But I want new orders given. She is not to be harmed. Whoever succeeds in capturing her will bring her here, to the palace, unharmed and alive." Chancellor Aldrich's eyes widened in disbelief. "Your Majesty, with respect, this woman has attacked royal hunters. Custom demands." "I am aware of what custom demands," Draven interrupted, his tone calm but final. "And I am telling you what I demand instead." The court fell silent once more, none daring to question their king further, though confusion and speculation danced behind every pair of eyes in the room. Even Draven himself could not fully explain the decision forming in his mind, only that something about this wolf's story refused to leave his thoughts. Outside the palace walls, unaware of the storm gathering around her name, Kira continued deeper into the forest, unaware that her next encounter would change the course of her life forever. The Palace of Ashcombe had never seen a council meeting quite like the one that followed King Draven's announcement. Nobles who usually spoke in careful, measured tones now argued openly in the corridors outside the throne room, their voices echoing off marble pillars that had stood witness to centuries of royal decisions. Never before had a king ordered mercy for someone who had struck down his own soldiers. Chancellor Aldrich paced back and forth across the council chamber, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Across from him sat General Roderick, the most respected military commander in the kingdom, a man whose loyalty to the crown had never once wavered in 20 years of service. Roderick listened quietly, his sharp eyes studying the Chancellor's obvious distress. "He wants her brought here," Aldrich said again, as though repeating the words might somehow make them easier to accept. "Alive, unharmed, treated as though she were a guest rather than a criminal who assaulted royal hunters." "The king has his reasons," Roderick said calmly, though even he could not fully hide the note of curiosity in his voice. "His reasons could cost him the respect of every noble house in this kingdom," Aldrich snapped back. "If word spreads that a common wolf can attack the crown's men and be rewarded with a place in the palace instead of punishment, what message does that send to every discontented village between here and the northern border?" Roderick considered this carefully before responding. "Perhaps the message is that our king values understanding over blind cruelty. Or perhaps he simply wishes to know why a lone survivor would risk everything to strike at hunters sent specifically to end her life." The Chancellor stopped pacing and turned to face the general directly. "You believe there is more to this than simple curiosity?" "I believe," Roderick said slowly, "that our king has not been the same since the reports began arriving about the massacre at Hollow Ridge years ago. He was young when that decree was signed, barely more than a prince learning the weight of the crown. I have long suspected that decision troubles him more than he ever admits." This admission hung heavy in the air between them, neither man willing to speak further on a subject that touched dangerously close to matters of old political intrigue within the palace walls. Meanwhile, in the private chambers reserved for the king himself, Draven stood alone before a tall window overlooking the city below. Ashcombe stretched out beneath him, rooftops catching the golden light of late morning, smoke rising lazily from countless chimneys, as ordinary life continued, unaware of the decision he had just made. He thought of the report Callum had delivered, the description of a wolf who fought with precision rather than rage, who spared lives when she easily could have taken them. Such restraint spoke of discipline, of someone who had been trained, or who had trained herself, to control instincts that most rogue wolves allowed to run wild. A knock interrupted his thoughts, and his personal advisor, a quiet woman named Eleanor, entered with a scroll in hand. "Your Majesty," she said, offering a respectful bow. "The search parties have been reorganized, according to your instructions. General Roderick will personally oversee the new pursuit, given the failure of the previous attempt." Draven nodded slowly, still gazing out the window. "Good. Make certain every hunter understands the new terms. She is not to be harmed under any circumstance, no matter what resistance she offers." Eleanor hesitated before speaking further, choosing her words with obvious care. May I ask your majesty, why this particular wolf has captured so much of your attention? We have dealt with rogues before. None have received such consideration. Draven turned from the window, studying his advisor for a long moment before answering. Because this one did not simply attack out of instinct or hunger. She chose her targets, she showed restraint, and according to Callum's report, she spoke of grievances against this crown before disappearing into the forest. I want to understand what those grievances are, before I decide how this story ends. Eleanor bowed again, accepting his answer without further question, though the thoughtful expression on her face suggested she suspected there was more beneath his words than he was willing to admit, even to himself. By midday, General Roderick had assembled a new hunting party, larger and more disciplined than the first, chosen specifically for their ability to remain calm under pressure rather than simply for their combat skill. He briefed them personally in the palace courtyard, his voice steady and commanding, despite the unusual nature of their mission. "You are not chasing an enemy today," Roderick told the assembled soldiers. "You are retrieving someone the king wishes brought before him safely. Anyone who causes unnecessary harm to this woman will answer directly to me." A young soldier near the back of the formation, a sharp-eyed woman named Ivy, raised her hand hesitantly. "General, if she resists as fiercely as the reports suggest, how are we meant to capture her without causing harm?" Roderick's expression remained serious as he considered the question. "With patience, with numbers, and with nets, rather than blades if it comes to that. The king wants her alive and whole. We will find a way to honor that command." The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, but none dared question their general further. Within the hour, they departed the palace grounds, moving toward the same forest where Kira had proven herself capable of outmaneuvering trained hunters, with nothing but her own skill and determination. Unaware of the growing forces mobilizing against her, Kira spent the day resting in a hidden cave, nestled deep within the rocky hills bordering the forest, a shelter she had discovered years ago and kept secret from every living soul. Here, surrounded by cold stone walls and the distant sound of dripping water, she allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. She thought back to the encounter in the forest, replaying the fear in the hunter's eyes, the way they had frozen at the mere sight of her. It should have felt satisfying, a small measure of justice against a kingdom that had taken everything from her. Instead, she felt only the familiar hollow ache that had followed her since the night her home burned. Her thoughts drifted to her mother's voice, warm and steady, teaching her as a child how to move silently through underbrush, without disturbing a single leaf. She thought of her younger brother, full of laughter and mischief, who had loved chasing fireflies through the meadow behind their village. Both had been lost in the fires that swept through Hollow Ridge, victims of a decree signed by a king, who likely never gave their names a second thought. Kira clenched her fists, forcing the memories back into the locked corner of her mind, where she kept them contained. Grief was a luxury she could not afford, not while she remained the last of her pack, not while there was still work to be done in avenging those who could no longer speak for themselves. She emerged from the cave as evening approached, moving carefully through the hills to gather what supplies she could, before continuing her journey deeper into hostile territory. It was during this careful movement that she first noticed signs of a new hunting party, larger and more organized than the last, spreading through the forest with methodical precision. She watched from a distance as soldiers moved in coordinated formations, carrying strange-looking nets rather than the blades she had expected. This confused her at first, until she realized the implication behind such unusual equipment. They were not trying to kill her this time. They were trying to capture her without causing harm. This revelation troubled her more than any blade could have. A king who ordered restraint against someone who had attacked his own soldiers was either foolish or calculating in ways she did not yet understand. Neither possibility comforted her. As darkness fell completely over the forest, Kira began moving with even greater caution, aware that this new group of hunters, led by a general whose reputation for discipline and skill was known even among rogue wolves scattered across the kingdom, would not make the same mistakes as their predecessors. General Roderick himself moved at the front of his formation, his sharp eyes scanning the darkened tree line, with the calm focus of a man who had commanded countless successful campaigns throughout his long career. He had studied every detail of Callum's report carefully, noting the patterns in Kira's movements, the way she had used darkness and confusion to her advantage, rather than relying on brute strength alone. She thinks like a strategist, not a wild animal, Roderick murmured to Ivy, who walked closely beside him through the shadowed underbrush. We will not defeat her through force. We will defeat her through patience and superior positioning. Ivy nodded, though uncertainty remained clear in her expression. And if patience is not enough, General? Roderick's jaw tightened slightly as he considered the question. Then we adapt. But know this, Ivy. Whatever happens tonight, the king's orders stand. She comes back to the palace alive, no matter what it costs us to make that happen. The soldiers continued their careful advance through the darkening forest, unaware that the very woman they sought was watching their approach from a hidden vantage point, calculating her next move with the same careful precision that had allowed her to survive alone in hostile territory for years longer than anyone believed possible. The stage was set for a confrontation that would ultimately change the course of both their lives, though neither Kira nor the soldiers pursuing her could yet imagine just how significantly that night would alter the future of the entire kingdom. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears and made every small sound feel amplified beyond reason. Kira crouched low behind a cluster of moss-covered boulders, watching the methodical advance of General Roderick's soldiers as they moved through the trees in tight, disciplined formations, unlike anything she had encountered before. These were not the same careless hunters from before. Every step they took was measured, every torch positioned to eliminate blind spots rather than simply illuminate the path ahead. She counted at least 20 soldiers, more than double the size of the previous group, and each one carried strange coiled ropes and woven nets instead of drawn blades. This puzzled her deeply. An army equipped to capture rather than kill suggested intentions she could not yet understand, and uncertainty was a dangerous companion in situations like this. She had survived this long by trusting her instincts completely, but tonight, her instincts offered no clear answers. She shifted her weight silently, considering her options. Running deeper into the forest remained possible, but these soldiers moved with a coordination that suggested they had anticipated exactly this response. Ahead of her, she noticed several soldiers positioned at wider intervals than the rest, likely meant to cut off any attempt at retreat toward the northern hills. A twig snapped somewhere to her left, and Kira's entire body tensed, ready to move. But it was not a soldier who had made the sound. A small fox darted across the clearing, startled by the approaching torches, and disappeared into the underbrush before any soldier could react. Kira allowed herself a brief breath of relief, though the tension in her shoulders did not fully release. She needed a new strategy, one that accounted for this unusual level of preparation and discipline among her pursuers. Recklessness had served her well against overconfident hunters who underestimated her abilities, but General Roderick clearly was not a man who made that particular mistake. Kira began moving carefully along the ridge above the soldiers' position, staying low and using the natural cover of fallen logs and thick underbrush to mask her movement. Her plan formed slowly as she studied their formation, noting weaknesses in coordination between the outer flanks and the central group. Below her, General Roderick raised a closed fist, signaling his soldiers to halt their advance. He scanned the tree line above with practiced patience, his sharp instincts telling him that their target was somewhere nearby, watching, calculating. "She's here," he said quietly to Ivy, who stood close beside him with her weapon lowered but ready. "I can feel it." Ivy studied the darkened ridge above them carefully. "How do you want to proceed, General?" "Tighten the formation," Roderick instructed. "Close every gap. If she wants to run, I want her running directly into our arms rather than away from them." The soldiers responded immediately, shifting their positions with practiced precision, closing the distance between individual units until the formation resembled a slowly tightening circle rather than a loose scattering of separate groups. From her position on the ridge, Kira watched this adjustment with growing concern. Her earlier plan, which relied on exploiting gaps in their coordination, was quickly becoming obsolete as the soldiers adapted to close those very weaknesses. She needed to act before the circle closed completely around her position. She made her decision quickly, choosing speed and surprise over the careful calculation she usually preferred. Dropping from the ridge in a controlled slide, she moved directly toward the weakest point remaining in their formation, a gap between two younger soldiers who had not yet fully adjusted to their new positions. The first soldier, a nervous young man named Corwin, barely had time to register movement before Kira was upon him. She avoided striking him directly, instead using her forward momentum to spin past him, disrupting his balance just enough to create confusion in the surrounding ranks. "She's breaking through!" someone shouted, and immediately the entire formation shifted, soldiers converging toward the point of disturbance with practiced urgency. Kira pushed forward, weaving between reaching hands and closing bodies, her speed and agility allowing her to slip through gaps that closed almost as quickly as she passed through them. A net swung toward her from the left, and she ducked beneath it in a fluid motion, rolling forward to avoid a second attempt from the opposite direction. General Roderick watched this display with something approaching genuine admiration, despite the urgency of the situation. "Remarkable," he murmured, before raising his voice to direct his soldiers with renewed focus. "Ivy, cut off her path toward the eastern ridge. The rest of you, converge toward the center." The soldiers responded instantly, their formation shifting once again to account for Kira's chosen direction. She noticed the change almost immediately, recognizing that her path forward was quickly narrowing into a dead end, formed by rocky terrain and the tightening circle of pursuing soldiers. For a brief moment, panic threatened to overtake her calculated composure. She had faced difficult odds before, but never against an opponent quite this disciplined, quite this prepared for her particular style of evasive combat. She spotted a narrow gap between two large boulders ahead, barely wide enough for her to squeeze through, and made an instant decision to commit to that path despite the risk involved. If she could reach the gap before the soldiers closed it, she might find a way to slip beyond their reach entirely. Ivy noticed the same opportunity from her position and sprinted forward, determined to intercept before Kira could reach the boulders. The two women converged at nearly the same moment, and for a brief, tense instant, their eyes met across the shrinking distance between them. Something in that exchange gave Kira pause, an unexpected flicker of hesitation in the soldier's eyes that suggested Ivy was not entirely comfortable with the nature of this pursuit. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but it was enough to shift Kira's approach in that critical moment. Rather than striking to disable the young soldier as she had done with previous hunters, Kira instead used a controlled maneuver to redirect Ivy's momentum harmlessly to the side, allowing herself to slip past without causing any lasting harm. It cost her precious seconds that allowed General Roderick to close the remaining distance between himself and his target. "Enough running," Roderick said calmly, positioning himself directly in Kira's path, with the confident stillness of a man who had faced countless dangerous situations throughout his long military career. "I have no wish to harm you. My orders are clear on that matter, but I will bring you before the king tonight, one way or another." Kira studied him carefully, recognizing immediately that this was not a man who would be easily deceived or outmaneuvered through simple tricks. "Your king has no right to summon me anywhere. He has already taken everything that mattered to me." "Perhaps," Roderick said, his tone remaining steady and measured, "but striking down his hunters will not return what you have lost. It will only ensure more bloodshed on both sides." His words struck something within her, a truth she had avoided confronting directly for years. She had told herself that her actions were justice, was retribution long overdue. But standing here now, faced with a man who spoke plainly, rather than with cruelty, doubt crept quietly into her resolve. The remaining soldiers closed the distance around her, while she remained momentarily distracted by this internal conflict. She realized too late that she had lost the narrow window of opportunity to escape, the circle now complete and inescapable, without causing significant harm to those closing in around her. "I could still fight through this," she said quietly, more to herself than to the general standing before her. "You could," Roderick agreed calmly, "and perhaps you would even succeed in escaping tonight. But eventually, exhaustion and isolation will accomplish what force alone cannot. Come with us willingly, and I promise you will be treated with the respect and fairness that this situation deserves." Kira weighed her limited options carefully, aware that continued resistance would only prolong an inevitable outcome, while risking greater harm to soldiers who, despite everything, had shown restraint and discipline throughout this entire encounter. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her hands from their defensive position. "If I go with you," she said firmly, "it is because I choose to, not because you have defeated me." "Understood," Roderick replied, offering a respectful nod that surprised her with its sincerity. "You have my word that no harm will come to you during this journey." The soldiers surrounding her relaxed slightly, though none fully lowered their guard, as Ivy stepped forward with soft ropes, rather than the metal chains typically used for dangerous captives. Kira allowed herself to be secured, though every instinct within her screamed against such vulnerability after years of fierce independence. As the group began their journey back toward the capital city, General Roderick walked closely beside Kira, studying her with quiet curiosity throughout the long trek through darkened forest paths. He found himself wondering what exactly awaited this remarkable woman once they arrived at the palace, and whether the king's unusual mercy would prove wise or foolish in the days that followed. Kira, for her part, remained silent throughout the journey, her mind racing with uncertainty about what fate awaited her within the walls of a palace ruled by the very king she held responsible for the destruction of everything she had once loved. Whatever happened next, she resolved to face it with the same unwavering strength that had carried her through years of solitary survival. The gates of Ashcombe Palace rose before Kira like the jaws of some enormous stone beast, their iron surfaces gleaming under the pale morning sun after a long night of travel through winding forest roads. She had never stood this close to the seat of royal power before, and despite her outward composure, something tightened uncomfortably in her chest as the massive doors creaked open to admit General Roderick's returning party. Guards stationed along the palace walls watched with open curiosity as the group passed through the courtyard, whispers spreading quickly among staff and soldiers alike. The rogue wolf who had defeated royal hunters not once but twice was finally within these walls, and everyone wanted to catch a glimpse of the woman responsible for such an unprecedented disruption to palace routine. Kira kept her chin raised, despite the ropes binding her wrists, refusing to let anyone see the uncertainty churning beneath her calm exterior. She had faced starvation, isolation, and countless dangers, alone in the wilderness, and she was determined not to show weakness now, surrounded by the very people she considered responsible for her suffering. General Roderick guided her through winding marble corridors, past tapestries depicting historical battles and ancient royal lineages, until they finally reached the towering doors leading into the throne room itself. He paused before entering, turning to address her directly for the first time since their journey began. "Whatever happens beyond these doors," he said quietly, "know that I intend to keep my word regarding your safety." Kira offered no response beyond a brief, measured nod, unwilling to grant him more trust than the situation strictly required. The doors opened before them, revealing a vast chamber filled with nobles, advisors, and curious onlookers who had gathered specifically to witness this unprecedented meeting between their king and the woman who had become the talk of the entire kingdom. At the far end of the chamber, seated upon an elevated throne carved from pale stone, King Draven Ashcombe watched her approach with an expression that revealed little of his true thoughts. His posture remained relaxed, almost casual, though his sharp eyes tracked every step she took across the polished floor. When she finally stood before him, close enough to see the fine details of his royal attire and the calculating intelligence behind his gaze, an uncomfortable silence settled over the entire throne room. Nobles exchanged uncertain glances, waiting to see how this extraordinary confrontation would unfold. "So," Draven said finally, breaking the silence with a voice that carried effortlessly through the vast chamber, "you are the woman who has caused such disruption among my hunters." Kira met his gaze directly, refusing to lower her eyes as tradition demanded before royalty. "And you are the king who ordered the massacre of my entire pack." Gasps rippled through the assembled court at her bold, unfiltered accusation, but Draven remained remarkably composed, studying her with renewed interest, rather than the anger many had expected from him. "That is a serious accusation," he said calmly, "one I would like to understand fully before responding." "There is nothing to understand," Kira replied sharply. "Years ago, your soldiers burned Hollow Ridge to the ground under royal decree. My family died in those flames. My entire pack was destroyed because your crown decided we posed some threat that never truly existed." The throne room fell into stunned silence, nobles shifting uncomfortably as the weight of her words settled over the gathered crowd. Chancellor Aldrich, standing near the throne, opened his mouth as though to interject, but Draven raised a single hand, silencing him without even glancing in his direction. "I remember the reports from Hollow Ridge," Draven said slowly, his expression growing more thoughtful. "I was young when that decree was signed, barely more than a prince still learning the responsibilities that would eventually fall upon my shoulders." "That does not absolve you of responsibility," Kira snapped back, her control slipping slightly as years of buried anger threatened to surface. You wear the crown. The decisions made under it are yours to answer for. Draven studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his sharp eyes. You are not entirely wrong, he admitted quietly, surprising many within the court who had expected him to dismiss her accusations entirely. But you should know that the full truth behind that decree may not be as simple as you believe. Kira's jaw tightened, suspicion coloring her expression. Do not attempt to twist words to escape accountability. I have no intention of escaping anything, Draven replied evenly. But accusations deserve investigation before judgment, on both sides of this conversation. You attacked my hunters, more than once, causing harm to soldiers who were simply following orders. Orders to hunt down and destroy anyone connected to a pack. Your crown already decided, deserved extermination, Kira countered fiercely. The tension in the room grew thick enough to feel physically oppressive, courtiers exchanging worried glances, as this exchange continued without any sign of the expected royal authority silencing such bold defiance. Yet Draven seemed almost fascinated, rather than offended by her continued resistance. Why did you spare the hunters you defeated? He asked suddenly, shifting the direction of their conversation. You could have ended their lives easily, based on the reports I received. Instead, you chose restraint each time. This question caught Kira off guard, and for a brief moment, her fierce composure wavered slightly. I am not a mindless killer, regardless of what your court might prefer to believe. No, Draven agreed thoughtfully, you are clearly not. Which raises an interesting question about your true intentions in attacking royal hunters in the first place, if not simply to cause harm. Kira remained silent, unwilling to reveal the deeper motivations behind her actions to a king she still considered fundamentally responsible for her suffering, regardless of whatever nuance he claimed existed behind the original decree. Draven rose slowly from his throne, descending the few steps that separated him from the main floor where Kira stood, still bound and surrounded by watchful guards. The court held its collective breath as their king approached the captured wolf directly, closing the distance between them, until only a few feet remained. I am ordering something unusual, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber. Rather than imprisonment or punishment, you will remain here, within the palace, until I have fully investigated the circumstances surrounding Hollow Ridge and the truth behind what happened there. Murmurs of disbelief spread rapidly through the assembled nobles, several advisors stepping forward with obvious objections forming on their lips. Chancellor Aldrich was among the first to speak, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. Your Majesty, this woman assaulted your soldiers. Precedent demands appropriate punishment, not the comfort of palace accommodations. Precedent, Draven repeated calmly, turning to address his chancellor directly, also demands that a king seek truth before delivering judgment. If there is even a possibility that past decisions made under this crown caused unjust suffering, I owe it to my kingdom to investigate that possibility fully before condemning someone for reacting to genuine grievance. The chancellor's expression remained troubled, but he offered no further immediate objection, recognizing the futility of arguing further before the entire assembled court. Kira watched this exchange with growing confusion, uncertain how to interpret a king who spoke of justice and investigation, rather than simple punishment, for actions that had genuinely harmed his soldiers. Everything she believed about the crown and its representatives suggested cruelty and indifference, not this unexpected consideration. Why? She finally asked, unable to contain her confusion any longer. Why would you extend such consideration to someone who has openly attacked your kingdom's forces? Draven studied her carefully before responding, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. Because something about your story troubles me deeply, and I have learned that troubled feelings often point toward truths worth uncovering, rather than convenient assumptions worth ignoring. The throne room remained tense with uncertainty as guards moved forward to escort Kira toward private chambers within the palace, following the king's unusual command, rather than the dungeons that tradition and precedent typically demanded for someone accused of such serious offenses against the crown. As she was led away, Kira glanced back once toward the throne, meeting Draven's steady gaze across the crowded chamber. Something passed between them in that brief exchange, an unspoken acknowledgement that both understood this situation had shifted into territory neither of them had fully anticipated when their paths first crossed in the depths of that shadowed forest. Whatever awaited her within these palace walls, Kira resolved to remain vigilant, unwilling to let unexpected kindness soften the resolve that had carried her through years of solitary struggle against a kingdom she still believed bore responsibility for the destruction of everything she once held dear. The chamber assigned to Kira within the palace was unlike anything she had experienced in years of forest survival, with soft furnishings and warm light spilling through tall windows overlooking the eastern gardens. Yet despite the evident comfort surrounding her, she remained rigid and alert, seated on the edge of a large bed, rather than allowing herself to relax into its inviting softness. A guard remained stationed outside her door, though he had made no attempt to enter or disturb her, since she had been brought here following the tense confrontation in the throne room. The silence of her surroundings, so different from the constant vigilance required during her years alone, gave her mind space to wander back toward memories she usually kept firmly locked away. She closed her eyes, and immediately, the past rose up to claim her thoughts entirely. Hollow Ridge had been a peaceful settlement, nestled within a valley, surrounded by dense forest and rolling hills, home to a pack that had lived in careful balance with the human villages nearby for generations. Kira remembered running through fields of tall grass as a child, chasing her younger brother Finnick while their mother watched from the doorway of their modest home, laughter echoing across the valley in those simpler days. Her father had served as an elder within the pack, respected for his wisdom and fairness in settling disputes among neighbors, both wolf and human alike. He had always believed that peaceful coexistence was possible, that the old fears separating their kind from ordinary humans could eventually be overcome through patience and mutual understanding. That belief had cost him everything. Kira remembered the night clearly, though she had spent years trying desperately to forget every painful detail. Soldiers had arrived without warning under cover of darkness, carrying torches and blades, moving through the village with brutal efficiency that suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous violence. She had been young then, barely more than a teenager, hiding beneath the floorboards of their home, while her mother pressed a trembling hand against her lips, urging silence even as screams echoed outside. Through gaps in the wooden planks, she had witnessed fragments of the destruction unfolding around her, flames consuming homes that had stood for generations, neighbors falling before soldiers who showed no hesitation or mercy despite pleas for explanation or reason. She remembered her father's voice, calm even in those final desperate moments, attempting to negotiate with soldiers who seemed entirely deaf to any words beyond their brutal orders. She never learned exactly what happened to him in those final moments, only that his voice eventually fell silent amid the chaos and destruction consuming their village. Her mother had pulled her from their hiding place, once the immediate danger seemed to pass, guiding her through smoke-filled streets toward the forest edge, where survival still seemed possible. But Finnick, her younger brother, had become separated during their desperate flight, lost somewhere within the burning chaos that had once been their peaceful home. Kira remembered screaming his name until her voice grew hoarse, her mother eventually forcing her to continue moving despite her desperate desire to search for him amid the flames. They never found him. She never learned whether he had died quickly or suffered, whether his final moments had been filled with fear, or simply confusion at events he could not possibly have understood. Her mother had survived only a few more months following that terrible night, weakened by grief and the harsh realities of life, as fugitives constantly fleeing further hunting parties, determined to eliminate any remaining survivors from Hollow Ridge. Kira had watched her mother's strength fade slowly, illness and sorrow combining to steal away the last connection she had to the family and home she once knew. Alone at barely 16 years old, Kira had been forced to learn survival through harsh experience, teaching herself skills that would eventually make her formidable enough to defeat trained hunters sent specifically to eliminate her. Every lesson had been paid for through pain, hunger, and the constant weight of grief she carried silently through years of solitary existence. Throughout those difficult years, she had held on to one burning question that refused to fade, regardless of time or distance. Why had the crown ordered such brutal destruction against a peaceful pack that had caused no genuine threat to the kingdom's security? She had heard rumors over the years, whispered conversations among travelers and traders who occasionally crossed her path in the wilderness, but nothing concrete enough to fully explain the tragedy that had shaped her entire life. Some claimed the decree had been issued out of fear, following isolated incidents elsewhere in the kingdom, Wolves who had genuinely threatened human settlements through violence or theft. Others suggested political motivations, whispers of land disputes or resource competition that made eliminating an entire pack convenient for certain powerful interests within the royal court. Kira had eventually settled on believing the simplest explanation available, that the young king, barely more than a prince at the time, had signed the decree without genuine understanding or concern for the innocent lives it would ultimately destroy. This belief had fueled years of carefully planned vengeance, culminating in her recent attacks against royal hunters sent to finally eliminate her as the last remaining survivor of that terrible night. Yet now, sitting within the very palace she had sworn to make pay for her losses, she found herself troubled by Draven's unexpected words during their confrontation. He had spoken of investigating the truth behind Hollow Ridge, had suggested that circumstances surrounding that terrible decree might be more complicated than she had assumed throughout years of solitary anger and grief. Could it truly be possible that Draven himself had not fully understood the consequences of that decision when it was made? Or was this simply another manipulation, an attempt to soften her resolve before delivering whatever punishment truly awaited her once his curiosity regarding her unusual restraint had been satisfied? A soft knock at her door interrupted these turbulent thoughts, and Kira quickly composed herself, straightening her posture as the door opened to reveal Eleanor, the king's personal advisor, carrying a simple tray of food and drink. "I thought you might need something after such a long journey," Eleanor said gently, setting the tray upon a small table near the window, before turning to study Kira with quiet curiosity. "I do not require your kindness," Kira replied stiffly, though hunger gnawed uncomfortably at her stomach after days of minimal sustenance during her pursuit and capture. "Perhaps not," Eleanor said calmly, "but you might find it useful, regardless of your feelings toward its source." Kira studied the woman carefully, searching for hidden motives behind her seemingly genuine concern. "Why does your king care what happens to me? I have caused nothing but trouble since arriving in this kingdom's territory." Eleanor considered this question thoughtfully before responding. "Our king has carried the weight of decisions made during his early reign more heavily than most people realize. If your story connects to genuine wrongdoing during that period, I believe he genuinely wishes to understand and address it properly, rather than simply dismissing your grievances as those of a common criminal." "And if his investigation reveals nothing to support my accusations?" Kira asked pointedly, unwilling to fully trust such seemingly generous intentions without proof. "Then perhaps you will have gained a clearer understanding of what truly happened to your family, even if that truth proves more complicated than the anger you have carried for so long," Eleanor replied honestly, before offering a respectful bow and departing quietly from the chamber. Left alone once again with her thoughts, Kira stared silently at the food before her, memories of her lost family mixing uncomfortably with newfound uncertainty regarding the true nature of the king, who had chosen mercy over punishment despite every reasonable justification for the opposite response. Perhaps, she thought reluctantly, there was more to uncover within these palace walls than simple vengeance or justice. Perhaps the truth behind Hollow Ridge remained more complicated than the singular narrative she had constructed to fuel years of solitary survival and calculated retribution against a kingdom she had convinced herself bore complete responsibility for every painful loss she had endured. Whatever the coming days revealed, Kira resolved to remain watchful, guarding her heart carefully against manipulation, while simultaneously allowing herself the possibility, however small, that genuine justice might yet emerge from circumstances she had never expected to encounter within these unfamiliar palace walls. Days passed within the palace walls, and Kira found herself adjusting reluctantly to a routine unlike anything she had experienced since the destruction of Hollow Ridge years earlier. Guards remained stationed outside her chamber at all times, though their presence felt more protective than threatening, a fact that continued to unsettle her deeply, given everything she believed about the crown and its representatives. Meals arrived regularly, prepared with far greater care than the simple sustenance she had scavenged throughout years of forest survival. Fine clothing had been provided as well, soft fabrics replacing the worn and practical garments she had relied upon during her solitary existence. Yet she wore these unfamiliar comforts with visible discomfort, as though accepting them somehow betrayed the fierce independence that had defined her survival for so long. She spent much of her time seated near the window overlooking the eastern gardens, watching palace staff move through their daily routines with the kind of ordinary normalcy she had almost forgotten existed. Children occasionally played among the hedges below, their laughter carrying faintly through the glass, and each time she heard such sounds, thoughts of her lost brother Finnick surfaced unbidden, sharp and painful despite the passage of years. General Roderick visited her occasionally during this period, ostensibly to ensure her continued cooperation with palace routine, though Kira suspected his visits held deeper purpose beyond simple oversight. He spoke to her with the same measured respect he had shown during their initial confrontation in the forest, treating her more as a person deserving consideration than a dangerous criminal requiring constant vigilance. The king has assigned scholars to review the original records surrounding the Hollow Ridge Decree, Roderick informed her during one such visit, standing respectfully near the doorway, rather than intruding fully into her private space. It may take time to uncover the full truth, given how many years have passed. And what if the truth simply confirms what I already believe? Kira asked, studying him carefully for any sign of deception or manipulation. Then justice will be served according to whatever that truth reveals, Roderick replied honestly. Our king is many things, but dishonest is not typically among them, at least not in my years of service under his rule. Kira found herself increasingly curious about this king, who continued to defy every expectation she had carried into this palace, regarding royal cruelty and indifference. She began asking careful questions during Roderick's visits, gradually learning more about Draven's history and the circumstances surrounding his early reign. She learned that Draven had inherited the crown unexpectedly young, following the sudden illness that claimed his father's life, when Draven was barely more than 18 years old. Thrust into leadership before he had fully completed his education in matters of governance and diplomacy, he had relied heavily upon his father's former advisors during those early turbulent years, individuals whose loyalty and honesty had not always matched the trust placed upon them. This revelation troubled Kira deeply, though she refused to fully accept it as sufficient explanation for the tragedy that had destroyed her family and pack. Young or inexperienced, a king still bore ultimate responsibility for decisions made under his authority, regardless of whatever advisors had guided his hand during those uncertain early days. Yet despite her continued reservations, she found herself unable to dismiss entirely the possibility that circumstances surrounding Hollow Ridge had been more complicated than simple royal cruelty directed against innocent victims. Perhaps, she considered reluctantly, there had been manipulation at play, deception directed toward a young and inexperienced ruler by advisors with motivations of their own. One afternoon, as autumn sunlight filtered gently through her chamber window, Kira found herself joined unexpectedly by King Draven himself, who arrived without the usual formal announcement or entourage that typically accompanied royal visits throughout the palace. "May I speak with you privately?" he asked, standing respectfully near the entrance rather than presuming immediate welcome into her space. Kira studied him carefully, surprised by this unexpected informality from a man whose position typically commanded absolute deference from everyone around him. "You are the king." "I hardly believe my permission carries any real weight in this matter." "Perhaps not officially," Draven acknowledged, stepping further into the chamber as she offered no direct objection. "But I would prefer this conversation happen with your willing participation, rather than simple obligation." She gestured toward a chair near the window, allowing him to settle into the seat while she remained standing, unwilling to fully relax her guard, despite the surprisingly respectful nature of his approach. "My scholars have made progress reviewing the historical records surrounding Hollow Ridge," Draven began, his expression growing serious as he studied her carefully. "What they have uncovered so far raises troubling questions I did not anticipate when I first ordered this investigation." Kira's heart quickened slightly, though she maintained careful composure as she waited for him to continue. "What have they found?" "The original decree authorizing action against Hollow Ridge was signed under my seal," Draven admitted, his voice carrying genuine discomfort at this admission. "But the specific orders detailing the scope and method of that action appear to have been altered significantly from what I originally approved." "Altered by whom?" Kira demanded, tension coiling through her body as implications began forming within her racing thoughts. "That remains unclear," Draven admitted honestly, "but the record suggests someone within my early council expanded what should have been a limited investigation into isolated incidents of conflict, into a broader campaign, against the entire pack, using my seal, without my full knowledge, or genuine consent, regarding such extreme measures. Kira stared at him, uncertain whether to believe such a convenient explanation or dismiss it as clever manipulation designed to escape accountability for tragedy she had spent years attributing directly to his authority. Why should I believe such a claim, rather than simply another attempt to avoid responsibility for what happened to my family? Draven met her gaze steadily, his expression carrying none of the defensive posturing she had expected from someone attempting deception. Because I have no reason to lie to you now, having already ordered a full investigation that could easily have implicated me personally, rather than uncovering evidence suggesting otherwise. If I wished simply to escape blame, I could have dismissed your accusations entirely, rather than pursuing uncomfortable truths that threaten the stability of my own counsel. This logic struck Kira as genuinely persuasive, though years of carefully cultivated distrust made her reluctant to fully accept such a conclusion without further evidence. If what you say is true, then who within your council would have possessed both the motivation and opportunity to orchestrate such a devastating deception? Draven's expression grew troubled as he considered this question carefully. I have my suspicions, though I am not yet prepared to name them publicly, without stronger evidence supporting such serious accusations. Certain individuals within my early council held significant interest in the territories surrounding Hollow Ridge, interests that would have been considerably advanced by the elimination of your pack's claim to that land. Kira felt something shift within her chest, anger mixing uncomfortably with a dawning realization that the simple narrative she had carried for years might indeed be more complicated than she had ever allowed herself to consider. If this is true, then the true architects of my family's destruction may still walk freely within these very palace walls. Yes, Draven confirmed grimly, which is precisely why I intend to uncover the full truth, regardless of whatever uncomfortable revelations that pursuit might eventually bring to light. The conversation left Kira with far more questions than answers, her carefully constructed understanding of the tragedy that had shaped her entire life, now trembling beneath the weight of new possibilities she had never previously considered. Yet despite the uncertainty this revelation introduced, she found herself experiencing something unfamiliar and unexpected, a fragile, cautious trust toward the very king she had sworn vengeance against for years of solitary suffering. Whatever truth eventually emerged from this investigation, Kira resolved to see it through completely, no longer content with the simple certainty that had fueled her actions until now, but genuinely determined to understand fully who truly bore responsibility for the destruction of everything she had once loved. Weeks passed as the investigation into Hollow Ridge continued quietly behind palace walls, scholars and trusted advisors sorting through decades of records, correspondence, and financial documents in search of concrete evidence supporting Draven's growing suspicions. Kira remained within the palace throughout this period, her initial hostility gradually softening into cautious cooperation as she began to genuinely believe that justice, rather than mere convenience, guided this careful pursuit of truth. One evening, General Roderick arrived at her chamber, with unusual urgency evident in his normally composed expression. "The king requests your presence immediately," he said, his voice carrying a seriousness that immediately captured her full attention. "The scholars have uncovered something significant." Kira followed him quickly through the palace corridors, her heart racing with anticipation as they made their way toward the king's private study, rather than the formal throne room, where their initial confrontation had taken place. Inside, Draven stood beside a large table, covered with scattered documents, his expression tight with barely controlled anger. "What has been found?" Kira asked immediately, unable to contain her impatience any longer. Draven gestured toward several documents spread across the table, his jaw tight with evident frustration. "Financial records from the period surrounding the Hollow Ridge decree. They reveal substantial payments made to a private mercenary group, payments authorized outside normal military channels, and specifically timed just before the attack on your pack." "Payments authorized by whom?" Kira demanded, stepping closer to examine the documents herself despite her limited understanding of formal royal record-keeping. "Lord Venlac," Draven said grimly, naming a figure Kira vaguely recognized from occasional mentions during her time within the palace. "A member of my father's original council, who retained significant influence during my early reign, before I fully understood the extent of political manipulation occurring around me." Kira felt her pulse quicken with a mixture of anger and vindication as pieces of this troubling puzzle began finally falling into place. What did this Lord Venlac stand to gain from destroying my pack? Territory, Draven answered simply. Hollow Ridge and its surrounding lands held valuable mineral resources that had gone largely unexploited due to your pack's long-standing claim to that region. With your people eliminated, those lands quickly transferred into holdings controlled indirectly through associates connected to Lord Venlac's family. The full weight of this revelation settled heavily over Kira. Years of assumed simple royal cruelty, now replaced by a far more calculated and cynical motivation, driven by simple greed rather than any genuine concern regarding security or governance. He used your seal, manipulated your authority, as a young and inexperienced king, purely to enrich himself through the destruction of an entire peaceful community. It appears so, Draven confirmed, his voice carrying genuine remorse, despite his own limited direct involvement in the original tragedy. I should have questioned more carefully during those early years, should have understood better the true implications of decisions made under my authority, rather than trusting so completely in advisors who did not deserve such faith. Kira studied him carefully, recognizing genuine guilt and regret within his expression, rather than the calculated deception she had originally suspected might exist behind his unusual mercy toward her. You could not have known everything, especially as a young ruler suddenly thrust into such heavy responsibility. Perhaps not, Draven acknowledged, but that does not fully absolve me of the consequences that resulted from my inexperience and misplaced trust. Their conversation was interrupted by Eleanor's sudden arrival, her expression carrying evident concern as she approached with fresh information. Your Majesty, we have reason to believe Lord Venlac has become aware of this investigation. Servants report unusual activity within his private quarters, suggesting he may be preparing to flee the capital before formal accusations can be brought against him. Draven's expression hardened immediately with renewed determination. We cannot allow him to escape accountability for what he has done. Roderick, gather trusted soldiers immediately. We move against Venlac tonight, before he has opportunity to disappear beyond our reach. I want to be part of this, Kira said firmly, stepping forward with unwavering resolve evident in her posture. Draven studied her carefully before responding. This is dangerous, Kira. Venlac has resources and connections that could make this confrontation genuinely perilous. I have survived far greater dangers alone in the wilderness for years, Kira replied firmly. This man is responsible for destroying my entire family and pack through calculated greed, rather than any legitimate concern for the kingdom's welfare. I have every right to see him face justice for that crime. Draven considered her request carefully, recognizing the genuine strength and determination behind her words. Very well. You will accompany us, but you will follow Roderick's guidance regarding tactical decisions throughout this confrontation. Kira nodded firmly, grateful for this acknowledgement of her right to participate directly in bringing justice against the true architect of her family's destruction, rather than remaining a passive observer while others determined the fate of the man responsible for such devastating tragedy. Within the hour, a small group of trusted soldiers, led personally by General Roderick and accompanied by both Draven and Kira, moved quietly through darkened palace corridors toward the wing housing Lord Venlac's private quarters. Eleanor had confirmed through discreet inquiry that the nobleman remained within his chambers, apparently still finalizing preparations for what appeared to be an imminent departure from the capital. They approached his door carefully, soldiers positioned strategically to prevent any possibility of escape through alternative routes. Roderick knocked firmly, his expression carrying the calm authority of a man who had faced countless confrontations throughout his distinguished military career. Lord Venlac, he called clearly, open this door immediately by order of the king. A long moment of silence followed, before the sound of hurried movement became audible from within the chambers. Roderick exchanged a quick glance with Draven before signaling his soldiers to force entry, unwilling to risk the possibility that their target might attempt escape through some alternative exit, while they waited patiently for voluntary compliance. The door gave way under the combined effort of two soldiers, revealing Lord Venlac standing near an open window, a small satchel of belongings clutched tightly in his hands, as clear evidence of his intended flight from justice. Your Majesty, Venlac said, his voice carrying poorly concealed panic, despite obvious efforts to maintain composure before his king. I was not expecting such a late visit. I imagine not, Draven replied coldly, stepping fully into the chamber with Kira close beside him. especially given your apparent preparations for a sudden and unannounced departure from the capital. Venlak's eyes darted nervously between the assembled group, recognition and dawning fear becoming evident as his gaze settled briefly upon Kira's determined expression. I do not understand what this intrusion is meant to accomplish, Your Majesty. Do not insult my intelligence further with false confusion, Draven said sharply, his patience clearly exhausted following weeks of careful investigation into this man's calculated betrayal. We have uncovered clear evidence connecting you directly to the manipulation of royal decrees, resulting in the unjust destruction of an entire peaceful pack purely for your own financial gain. Venlak's composure finally cracked completely, his shoulders slumping, as the weight of exposed guilt settled visibly upon him. It was necessary, he said quietly, though desperation colored his tone rather than genuine conviction. The kingdom needed those resources, and your inexperience at the time made certain difficult decisions impossible to explain adequately, without risking unnecessary complications. You mean decisions that enriched yourself and your family at the cost of innocent lives? Kira interjected sharply, unable to remain silent any longer in the face of such calculated justification for unforgivable cruelty. Venlak turned toward her, recognition finally settling fully into place. You are the survivor, he said quietly. I had heard rumors, but I did not believe any of them could have survived our original efforts to ensure complete elimination of that troublesome pack. I survived, Kira confirmed coldly, and I have spent every day since carrying the weight of what your greed and cruelty took from me. Draven stepped forward, his expression carrying the full authority of his position, as he addressed the trembling nobleman directly. Lord Venlak, you are hereby placed under arrest for treason against the crown, manipulation of royal decree, and the unjust destruction of innocent lives for personal financial gain. You will be held accountable fully for these crimes before formal court proceedings. Soldiers moved forward immediately, securing the defeated nobleman despite his weak attempts at further protest and justification. As they led him away toward the palace dungeons, Kira felt a complex mixture of emotions settling over her: satisfaction at finally confronting the true architect of her family's destruction, mixing uncomfortably with the lingering grief that no amount of justice could ever fully resolve. Draven turned to her once Venlak had been removed from the chamber, his expression carrying genuine sympathy, despite the victory this confrontation represented. This will not undo what you have lost, but I hope it provides some measure of the truth and accountability you have deserved for far too long. Kira nodded slowly, unable to fully articulate the tangled emotions swirling within her following this long-awaited confrontation. It is a beginning, she said quietly, though healing from such deep loss will require far more time than a single moment of justice can provide. Draven studied her carefully, something gentle and understanding evident within his expression. Then we will ensure you have whatever time you need, within these walls or wherever you eventually choose to make your home going forward. His words carried unexpected warmth that Kira found herself unwilling to immediately dismiss, a fragile hope beginning to take root, despite years of hardened distrust toward everything connected to the crown and palace she now found herself standing within. News of Lord Venlak's arrest spread rapidly throughout the capital, sending ripples of shock and disbelief through noble houses that had long considered him one of the most influential figures within royal politics. Whispers filled every corridor of the palace, servants and courtiers alike speculating about the full extent of his crimes and what consequences might ultimately follow such a serious betrayal of royal trust. Chancellor Aldrich, who had initially opposed Draven's decision to show mercy toward Kira, found himself confronting uncomfortable truths regarding his own past dealings with the now disgraced nobleman. Summoned before the king for private questioning, he arrived visibly shaken by recent events. I had no knowledge of the full extent of Venlak's schemes, Aldrich insisted, standing before Draven's desk with genuine distress evident in his weathered features. Our dealings remain strictly limited to legitimate matters of council business. I believe you, Draven said after studying him carefully for a long moment. But this situation demonstrates precisely why I intend to review every decision made during those early years of my reign, far more carefully than I previously considered necessary. Aldrich nodded solemnly, understanding clearly the gravity of this royal determination. I will assist however I can, Your Majesty, in ensuring nothing similar occurs again under your rule. Meanwhile, preparations began for Lord Venlak's formal trial, a proceeding that would require careful presentation of evidence before the full royal court to ensure complete transparency regarding his crimes. Draven insisted on this public accountability, recognizing that true justice required more than simple private punishment behind closed doors. Kira found herself increasingly involved in these preparations, providing testimony regarding her personal experience of the tragedy that had resulted from Venlak's calculated manipulation of royal authority. Though such involvement forced her to confront painful memories repeatedly, she recognized the importance of ensuring complete and thorough justice for her lost family and pack. During one such preparation session, held within a quiet chamber, away from the bustle of general palace activity, Kira found herself alone with Draven, as they reviewed testimony together, in preparation for the upcoming trial. "You do not have to relive these memories if it becomes too difficult," Draven said gently, noticing the visible strain evident in her expression as she recounted details from that terrible night years earlier. "I want justice done properly," Kira replied firmly, though gratitude for his consideration was evident beneath her determined tone. "My family deserves that, even if I cannot fully recover what was taken from us through such calculated cruelty." Draven studied her with quiet admiration, recognizing the remarkable strength she had demonstrated throughout this entire ordeal, from her initial solitary battle against royal hunters, through this difficult process of confronting painful history, in pursuit of genuine accountability. "You have shown incredible courage throughout all of this, Kira. Not many people could face such tragedy and still fight so persistently for justice, rather than simply succumbing to despair or endless anger." "Anger has kept me alive for years," Kira admitted quietly, surprising herself with such an honest admission. "But I am beginning to understand that anger alone cannot build anything lasting or meaningful going forward." Their conversation was interrupted by Eleanor's arrival, carrying additional documents relevant to the upcoming proceedings. She paused briefly upon entering, noticing the quiet intimacy of the moment shared between the king and his unusual guest, before proceeding with her official business. "Your Majesty," she said respectfully, "additional testimony has been gathered from several minor officials who witnessed direct communications between Lord Venlak and the mercenary group responsible for the attack on Hollow Ridge. This should strengthen our case considerably." Draven accepted the documents gratefully, though his attention remained partially focused on Kira, even as he reviewed this new evidence. "Excellent work, Eleanor. Please ensure copies are prepared for formal presentation during the trial." As Eleanor departed, Draven turned back toward Kira, his expression thoughtful. "Once this trial concludes and justice has been properly served, what do you intend to do? You are welcome to remain within the palace as long as you wish, but I understand if you prefer returning to your former way of life." Kira considered this question carefully, recognizing that her answer carried significant weight regarding the future direction of her life, following years defined entirely by solitary survival and calculated vengeance. "I am not certain," she admitted honestly. "For so long, my only purpose was surviving and eventually confronting those responsible for my family's destruction. Now that purpose feels increasingly resolved, I find myself uncertain what comes next." "Perhaps that uncertainty itself represents an opportunity," Draven suggested gently, "rather than something to fear. You are no longer bound entirely by grief and vengeance. You have the freedom now to choose whatever path feels meaningful to you." His words resonated deeply within her, offering a perspective she had not fully considered throughout years of singular focus on survival and retribution. That is a strange kind of freedom to consider, after so long defined by loss and anger. "Strange, perhaps," Draven agreed, "but not necessarily unwelcome." The trial of Lord Venlak proceeded several days later, before the full assembled royal court, evidence presented methodically demonstrating the clear pattern of manipulation and greed that had motivated his calculated betrayal of royal trust. Kira provided her testimony with steady composure, describing the devastating consequences of decisions made purely for personal financial gain, rather than any legitimate concern for kingdom security. Venlak offered little genuine defense against the overwhelming evidence presented, his earlier confidence completely shattered, following weeks of confinement and reflection regarding the consequences of his exposed crimes. When Draven finally delivered judgment, sentencing him to permanent exile and complete forfeiture of all lands and titles previously held by his family, the assembled court offered no objection to what was widely recognized as fitting justice for such calculated cruelty. As the trial concluded and Venlak was led away to begin his sentence, Kira felt an unexpected weight lifting from her shoulders. Years of carried grief and anger, finally finding some measure of resolution through this long-awaited moment of formal accountability. She glanced toward Draven, who met her gaze with quiet satisfaction and genuine warmth that suggested their unlikely journey together had created something meaningful beyond simple justice alone. Whatever uncertain future awaited her beyond these palace walls, Kira found herself increasingly open to possibilities she never would have considered during her years of solitary survival. Possibilities that now seemed to extend far beyond simple vengeance, towards something resembling genuine hope, for the first time since the terrible night that had originally destroyed everything she once held dear. In the weeks following Lord Venlak's trial, the palace gradually returned to its usual rhythm, though something within its walls had undeniably shifted following the extraordinary events surrounding Kira's arrival and the uncovering of long-buried royal secrets. Nobles who had once whispered doubts regarding the king's unusual mercy now spoke instead of his wisdom in pursuing genuine truth rather than convenient assumptions. Kira remained within the palace during this period, no longer confined as a captive, but genuinely welcomed as an honored guest, whose courage and resilience had ultimately exposed corruption that might otherwise have remained hidden indefinitely. She continued adjusting slowly to this unfamiliar new existence, finding herself increasingly drawn into conversations and activities she never would have imagined participating in during her years of solitary forest survival. General Roderick, who had initially pursued her through the forest with determined professionalism, gradually became something resembling a trusted friend throughout this transition period. He often sought her company during evening walks through the palace gardens, their conversations ranging from military strategy to lighter topics that helped ease her ongoing adjustment to palace life. "You have adapted remarkably well," Roderick observed one evening as they walked together beneath blooming trees that filled the eastern gardens with delicate fragrance. "Given everything you experienced before arriving here." "I would not say I have fully adapted," Kira replied honestly, "but I am learning, slowly, that not everything within these walls represents the cruelty I once assumed defined this entire kingdom." Roderick nodded thoughtfully. "The king speaks highly of your courage and honesty. I believe your presence here has changed him as well, perhaps more than either of you fully realizes." Kira considered this observation carefully, aware that her relationship with Draven had indeed evolved significantly since their initial hostile confrontation within the throne room. What had begun as bitter accusation and defensive justification had gradually transformed into something resembling genuine mutual respect and understanding, built through shared pursuit of difficult truth and accountability. Their conversations had continued regularly throughout the weeks following Venlak's trial, often extending late into evening hours, as they discussed everything from kingdom governance to personal history, and shared philosophical perspectives regarding justice and forgiveness. Kira found herself increasingly comfortable in Draven's presence, her initial fierce hostility gradually giving way to genuine warmth she had never expected to feel toward anyone connected to the crown. One particular evening, as autumn gave way to the first signs of approaching winter, Draven invited her to join him for a private dinner within his personal study rather than the formal dining halls typically reserved for royal guests. She accepted, curious about this continued informality he seemed to prefer during their increasingly frequent interactions. "I wanted to discuss something with you," Draven said, once they had settled comfortably within his private chambers, the warm glow of candlelight casting gentle shadows across scattered books and documents covering his expansive desk. "Regarding your future, now that Venlak's trial has concluded and justice has been properly served." Kira studied him carefully, curiosity evident in her expression. "What exactly did you have in mind?" "I would like to offer you a formal position within the kingdom," Draven explained, his tone carrying genuine sincerity rather than simple political calculation. "Not as a captive or temporary guest, but as someone with genuine standing and purpose here, should you choose to accept such an offer." "What kind of position?" Kira asked, genuinely intrigued despite her lingering uncertainty regarding such an unexpected proposal. "I have been considering establishing a new advisory role, focused specifically on relations between the crown and various pack communities scattered throughout the kingdom," Draven explained thoughtfully. "Your unique perspective, combined with your evident intelligence and strength of character, would make you uniquely qualified to help ensure that tragedies like what happened at Hollow Ridge never occur again under my rule. Kira remained silent for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of this unexpected offer. Such a position would represent complete transformation from her previous existence as a solitary survivor, driven purely by grief and vengeance, toward something resembling genuine purpose and belonging within a kingdom she had once considered entirely responsible for her suffering. "Why me specifically?" she finally asked, still struggling to fully process such an extraordinary proposition. "Because you understand firsthand the devastating consequences of decisions made without full consideration of their impact on innocent lives," Draven replied earnestly. "And because throughout everything you have experienced, you have consistently demonstrated remarkable restraint, wisdom, and genuine commitment to truth rather than simple revenge, even when circumstances would have justified far harsher responses." His words carried genuine conviction that Kira found herself unable to dismiss easily, recognizing the sincerity behind this unexpected offer of purpose and belonging, following years defined entirely by isolation and singular focus on survival and retribution. "I would need time to consider such a significant decision," she said finally, though something within her already sensed the direction her eventual answer would ultimately take. "Of course," Draven agreed immediately, respect evident in his tone. "Take whatever time you need. This offer will remain available, regardless of how long you require to reach your decision." Their conversation continued throughout the remainder of the evening, drifting toward lighter topics as they shared a comfortable dinner together, the earlier formal proposition gradually giving way to genuine personal connection that had been steadily building between them throughout recent weeks. Kira found herself laughing genuinely for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, the weight of years, defined by grief and isolation, finally beginning to lift as she allowed herself to embrace this unexpected new connection. As the evening drew to a close and she prepared to return to her chambers, Draven walked her personally through the quiet palace corridors, their conversation continuing comfortably despite the late hour. Near her chamber door, they paused together, an unspoken understanding passing between them regarding the significant transformation their relationship had undergone since that initial hostile confrontation weeks earlier. "Thank you," Kira said quietly, "for believing my accusations were worth investigating properly, rather than simply dismissing them as those of a common criminal." "Thank you," Draven replied warmly, "for your courage in confronting powerful corruption, despite every reasonable justification for continued anger and isolation instead." Their eyes met in the dim candlelight, something unspoken, but genuinely meaningful, passing between them in that quiet moment. Whatever decision Kira ultimately reached regarding Draven's proposal, she recognized clearly that her life had been irrevocably transformed by these recent extraordinary events, transformed in ways that extended far beyond simple justice, toward something resembling genuine hope and connection she had never expected to experience again, following the terrible loss that had once defined her entire existence. Winter settled fully over the kingdom of Ashcombe as Kira finally reached her decision regarding Draven's unexpected offer, weeks of careful consideration finally crystallizing into genuine clarity regarding the path she wished her future to follow. She requested a private audience with the king, her heart steady, despite the significant weight of the choice she had ultimately made. Draven received her within his study, the same warm chamber where their significant conversation regarding her future had originally taken place. He studied her expression carefully as she entered, recognizing immediately that she had arrived with a definitive answer to his earlier proposal. "I have made my decision," Kira said, standing before him with the same quiet strength and dignity that had characterized her throughout every difficult moment since their paths first crossed within that shadowed forest months earlier. "I am listening," Draven replied, his expression carrying genuine anticipation, despite his practiced royal composure. "I accept your offer," Kira said firmly. "I will serve as advisor regarding relations between the Crown and Pack communities throughout this kingdom, working to ensure that what happened to Hollow Ridge never occurs again under your rule, or any future ruler who follows your example." Draven's expression brightened with genuine relief and satisfaction at her decision, though he maintained careful composure befitting his royal position. "This brings me great happiness, Kira. Your wisdom and unique perspective will prove invaluable in shaping policies that genuinely protect innocent lives, rather than simply serving convenient political interests." There is something else, Kira added, her expression growing more thoughtful. I want Hollow Ridge properly acknowledged, not simply through private investigation and quiet justice, but through public recognition of what truly happened there. My family, my pack, they deserve to be remembered as victims of genuine injustice, rather than forgotten as simply another unfortunate incident buried within royal records. I intend exactly that, Draven confirmed immediately. I have already begun preparations for a formal royal proclamation acknowledging the truth behind Hollow Ridge, along with plans to establish a permanent memorial honoring those who lost their lives through Lord Venlak's calculated betrayal of royal trust. Kira felt genuine gratitude swelling within her chest at this confirmation, recognizing that her long pursuit of justice had finally achieved something meaningful beyond simple personal vengeance or satisfaction. Her family, her pack, would finally receive the acknowledgement and remembrance they had been denied for far too many years, following their tragic and unjust destruction. Several weeks later, a formal ceremony took place within the palace courtyard, attended by nobles, commoners, and representatives from various pack communities scattered throughout the kingdom, who had traveled considerable distances to witness this unprecedented royal acknowledgement. Draven stood before the assembled crowd, Kira positioned respectfully beside him as he delivered his formal proclamation. Years ago, Draven began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. A grave injustice occurred within this kingdom, an injustice that resulted from corruption and greed, rather than any legitimate concern for security or governance. The peaceful pack of Hollow Ridge was destroyed not through necessity, but through the calculated manipulation of royal authority for personal financial gain. Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd as this formal acknowledgement confirmed rumors and suspicions that had circulated quietly for years following the original tragedy. Draven continued, his expression carrying genuine solemnity, befitting such a significant moment of accountability and remembrance. Today, I formally acknowledge this injustice, and I commit this kingdom to ensuring such tragedy never occurs again under my rule. A permanent memorial will be established at the site of Hollow Ridge, honoring the memory of those who lost their lives, and new policies will be implemented, ensuring proper investigation and accountability before any future action is taken against pack communities throughout this kingdom. The crowd erupted into respectful applause, many among the pack representatives visibly moved by this unprecedented royal acknowledgement of past wrongdoing. Kira felt tears forming despite her best efforts at maintaining composure. The weight of years spent seeking justice, finally finding genuine resolution through this powerful public recognition. Following the formal ceremony, Draven turned toward her privately, his expression carrying warmth that extended beyond simple professional respect toward something considerably deeper. I hope this brings you some measure of peace, Kira, even if it cannot fully restore what you lost so many years ago. It does, Kira replied honestly, genuine emotion evident in her voice, despite her efforts at maintaining composure before the dispersing crowd. More than I ever believed possible when I first arrived here. Filled with nothing but anger and determination for vengeance against a kingdom I believed held no capacity for genuine justice or understanding. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that extended beyond simple professional respect or gratitude toward genuine affection that had steadily grown throughout their unlikely journey together, from initial hostile confrontation toward mutual understanding and respect. Kira, Draven said quietly, his tone carrying unusual hesitation despite his typically confident royal bearing. I find myself hoping that your future here extends beyond simply your new advisory position, into something considerably more personal, should you find yourself open to such a possibility. Kira studied him carefully, recognizing the genuine vulnerability behind his careful words, so different from the confident authority he typically displayed before his court and subjects. I believe, she said slowly, a genuine smile finally breaking through her usual careful composure, that I would welcome exploring exactly what such a personal connection might mean for both of us, going forward. Draven's answering smile carried genuine joy that extended beyond simple royal satisfaction toward something considerably more personal and meaningful. Together, they turned to face the dispersing crowd, standing side by side as symbols of a kingdom finally choosing genuine truth and accountability over convenient silence and continued injustice. In the months that followed, Kira settled fully into her new role and new life within Ashcombe. no longer defined by the singular grief and vengeance that had shaped her existence for so many years, but instead embracing genuine purpose, connection, and hope for a future she had never imagined possible during her years of solitary survival within the shadowed forest that had once been her only refuge. She had arrived at these palace walls as a hunted fugitive, expected to face punishment for daring to fight back against injustice. Instead, she had found truth, accountability, and unexpected connection that transformed not only her own life, but the future direction of an entire kingdom, finally willing to confront its own past mistakes, with genuine honesty and commitment toward lasting justice for all who called it home.